My friends, thanks for tuning. So today we are going to discuss an important lesson about the common error into architecture. So if you check the syllabus, we reach almost the finish of the browsing of all layer of infrastructure. And in this infrastructure security course, we used the chapter one to make you familiar with all problem, and if you see, all lessons are structured and giving you food for thought. So it's really important to close this chapter explaining the common thinking problem. And to do it isn't easy. And we need to follow a structure that is logical. So back in the days, I did a paper on how to perform an infrastructure gap analysis. You can find it here at this address. And I'm in the target of the paper is to explain how to have a logical structure on understanding how security control overlaps, which kind of problem you could have, for example, the SSL termination, and so that the controls are extremely binded also to the configuration, and in which layer the SSL handshake is happening, for example. This structure is the one that I wanted to use today for this lesson, and so to have a logical walkthrough. So to summarize what I describe in this paper, I I see logical from an attacking perspective, from an analysis perspective, to use a sound and well-established analysis through an ISO layer. That is giving you the distinguish if each security control does something at that layer. And in a summary of analysis, we can show you also overlap on that space. But the OSI layer on its own don't cover all aspects that in security you need to cover. It's the reason why I added layer 0, that is the one that you see, that is asset and data. And so I mean the endpoint, the data, and everything is OS related. When on top, following the normal way to talk, layer 8 is the user, but not just as a people in terms of processes, in terms of social engineering, but also as I am, and so in terms of identity. Like that, summing up that all, you can have a matrix that actually cover 360-degree whatever analysis you need to do across all security conversation. So I invite you to look at this slide, not just for this specific topic, but overall in general on understanding a structured thinking across gaps. I want to mention what are the common mistakes that you can find into designing. If you see the syllabus, I divided this lesson on the common architecture error, and so more at the design and thinking perspective, and the other one more on the implementation. If you go through that, you'll find that layer 0 is the endpoint, but the endpoint is having a boundaries of trust. So when you boot a device, you always have a firmware taking over, you have hardware consideration, you do have a certain stage of trusted boundaries. And somebody can also argue that there is always a trusted boundaries because the OS that you run, you never do a full secure code review. But let's talk in terms of designing a solution. Sometimes you find analysis that start when the OS is already up and running. But there is a plethora of things that happen before. All boot phase, all the fact that you have services like DHCP giving you address and all others. And so all these phases should be into your analysis, and it's the reason why we use this structured approach. So common mistake about layer 0 and the asset is not considering the trusted boundaries and give it for grant that your analysis should start when the system is up and running. It's not okay. On the other hand, one of a point of layer 0 is the fact that you need to join asset and data. So ISO 271 historically is having a big stress into asset inventory, whatever, understand the assets. But it was quite a good way of thinking, but it's not modern enough to bind to the data. And when you are having an incident, you want to know which asset got impacted, but also what was containing that asset and which kind of access got it. So is extremely critical in a modern way of thinking about security to have an approach where asset inventory is also a part of a DLP data life cycle. And so you need to cover all aspect of a data life cycle, and you need to merge the two. That is another common issue that I would categorize especially into the incident response. So one of the most difficult things and common, unfortunately, that you can find during an incident is people not having answer to easy question like what was there, which data. Considering also the complexity of a data breach where there is a lot of pivoting and everything, not having the right foundation on this aspect is already a roadblock, and that is impacting also the quality of your investigation. So layer 0, these one are the most common issues. Layer 1, physical. You start, layer 1 is the electric signal, but before the electric signal you have a lot of stuff loading in kernel, and so it can be really wide. But from an OS step point, port security, the switch, the security of a connectivity, pineapple attack, whatever hijack your trust and your traffic at the very beginning of the entire conversation. So that sometimes isn't there into the overall architecture conversation, and is the reason why security architecture should add that value. The fact that is actually giving a real attacker perspective of a problem. So when you move forward to layer 2, data link, if you are on-prem, I would say that one of the most common problem is VLAN trunking, and is a big issue. Segregation at layer 2 is extremely important. You have double tag attack and all VLAN hopping conversation, but there is also design of a management interface. So what people doesn't generally realize is if you compromise something in the MZ and the attacker use a static route through the management VLAN, potentially it does traffic and is in touch with other device into a subnet that can have a different level of visibility monitoring, and if it's badly configured in terms of design architecture, it can have less segregation. And the lateral move analysis that I see when professional talk sometimes miss the management VLAN as a main conversation. When you do pen testing, you think about it a lot, because just an ARP table on that interface of the management on the management VLAN side give you a lot to enjoy and bypass potentially also firewall if is DMZ VLAN for the management is not segregated in proper manner. So extremely important, even if people don't think about. Doesn't change much if is an infrastructure as a service kind, and is crossing into the service mesh conversation and microsegmentation if you are into a PaaS conversation. That is the same also in terms of network, and you need to think about all this stuff because, for example, if the integrity of a service mesh impasse is critical. So if you see some project that don't consider an Istio kind of design, you could have been at the beginning of a legacy problem. People do think that nothing in cloud can be legacy, but it's not actually true because back in the days we had only services in cloud that could be called by API through public IP. Now they understood the risk of having a private API going to public to coming back, and so it was enlarging the attack surface. But you can find projects that are still having the old thinking. And so from an architecture perspective, that's really important. Think about the security of the overall. So on-prem and cloud doesn't change on that space. Obviously change the type of cloud because a conversation in PaaS will be strictly service mesh oriented and microservices oriented. And so you'll talk about visibility on the service mesh. Uh, when you if we want to follow more a TCP IP layer and we group up a bit, when you are going to the next layers, you seriously realize how TLS is adding complexity. Think about the ESNI information into a TLS 1.3 packet. So the thinking and the common mistake that I see there in the architecture is the fact to not think about the differentiator across protocols. It's true, if you are an enterprise architect, you are looking at the big picture in terms of framework and everything, but it need the translation need to solution architecture need to be clean. And sometimes translation between enterprise architecture and solution architecture give big gaps. So think about it in terms of pipelines, and in terms of everything. Another problem that I strictly bind to this session presentation layer is the CDN security conversation. So A/B testing introduced a new way of thinking, and sd-wan did as well, adding a lot of potential in application routing. So you find some architecture strictly bind to the old concept of networking and not thinking about application routing. That is another common mistake. It's now that everything moved to layer 7, you find some architecture conversation to be not up to date in terms of threat modeling as well, because people don't think in that way. In A/B testing and the compromise of a load balancing can change your attack surface, or even within a CDN. And sometimes another problem is the fact that if you need to think of multi-cloud, you need a common layer in CDN. With the integration from each cloud service provider of a CDN and the fact that it is less fashionable than before to have a third-party CDN is getting a big problem, is getting difficult when you are reviewing analysis on understanding which thinking the architect had, because we are all a group of people that think based on its own experience. Another issue that I do see is the orchestration layer that is coming at this stage as well. And so all portion of orchestration that can be outside your incident response domain is extremely important, because you get compromise that layer, you'll not get visibility in your incident response because it's probably third party, it's probably SaaS services, it's probably based on something else. And so you need into your security architecture thinking to add that. And connect the dots means extremely exactly that. How to glue blocks is the name of his slide, and is because everything in security architecture is how you dissect and how you connect things. You dissect because they give you solution, and you try to understand which are the piece of a puzzle that make that solution. So extremely important. Think about all these orchestration layer and how it can impact your threat modeling. Application. Here we go on the common mistake. The common mistake, everybody bought tons of products, especially in the pipeline. You find patchworks, and not even in a place like DevOps where everybody is supposed to be future thinking, you find some resistance to touch what is for them already legacy. And there are new way of reviewing code. Code QL is an example of that. New thinking, new integration, more integration is key for that. So you need to pay attention to that layer, extremely attention on how you optimize. Keep it simple is one of the biggest principle in security architecture, and I think is the biggest common mistake. We don't keep it simple. Too many silos working in parallel, not talking to each other too much probably. That is a common mistake, especially with evolution of DevOps that change a bit the size of its own garden and duty and responsibilities. People and IAM. I do like the fact that these two layer application and people and IAM are really so close. Because you see also on the attacking perspective how they are really dependent to each other. Dual factor authentication. Still the session, you can't care less. When is authenticated and authorized, still that session, and doesn't matter what got used. That is one of the biggest problem. Too much talking in various direction and not too much thinking into the attacking perspective. One of the main reason of that is that people understood the security architecture function as an evolution of enterprise architecture. Instead of an understanding that enterprise architecture is on designing how to build, and the security architect is how to disassemble things and think as an attacker. I'll never stop to stress out this point because it's a market point. But these layer 7 and layer 8 are extremely critical because they are glued to each other. So threat modeling only in code and not in infrastructure, and not thinking about session hijacking is one of the biggest common mistakes. Just open whatever talk and you see it. So even automation doesn't touch well this layer. And in people, you have a lot of internal threat. Right now, even more than before, probably. Even if I'm an advocate of the fact that it was always there. It's not just now the ransomware hiring is actually making something new. It was always a risk, a threat that was there. Just that company didn't see that too much, and they are still struggling. So focus on all these layers, also in terms of overall picture. If you see, I didn't want to distract your thinking, going across too many slides, fancy things. I wanted to show you the layer because are the one that are useful for thinking and structure your conversation. IAM suppose a lot of conditional access, policies, auditing, device fingerprinting. ZTA is a lot of thinking, but you see in all lessons that I made how I show you how to bypass all this stuff. So zoom out, see all layers, understand the dependency, and understand from where is starting your analysis. Another common issue that I see from an architecture and thinking and designing perspective is cloud design is quite specific in somehow. Sometimes you have limitations that are cloud service provider one in terms of services. You see architecture framework that don't consider that. And obviously everything changes slightly direction, a bit the direction somewhere else. You need to think that. You need to think that there is not anymore that distinguish that used to be about enterprise and solutioning. The two need to be together, and if you really want to have a big picture, the only way to do it is in any case have a multi-cloud hybrid design, because that will consider the overall picture, especially the hybrid from on-prem and multi-cloud. And the complexity of an hybrid design should be, in my opinion, the default for any analysis, because you see how many of these architecture analyses are strictly vendor oriented and how many problems they have to translate that to the future, to move to a multi-cloud strategy, to work out a better way also in terms of cost. Unfortunately, is a portion of our conversation is also cost oriented. So try to focus into your analysis on what are your assumptions, where your analysis starts and where it does finish. So see document that don't express the fact that you are not analyzing all boot sequence and that you don't see whatever conversation of attack can be CPU related. That need to be stated. It need to be seen. There is a big asymmetry between risk and threat, and there is a lot of misunderstanding that threat is just a nice picture. It has to be a continuous, having continuous feed on each API changes. And another common mistake that I see in general terms is not thinking about gateways. So we grew up with that thinking about gateways, but out of the blue disappear. The fact to have an API gateway is the way how you defend, because any fuzzing will not land straight into an endpoint. It will be a good place where to tap. So it's extremely important that you look into that. That is my overall picture of common mistakes. I could have gone more in deep on the technical side, but I want to give you the thinking, the way of thinking. It's like in self-defense. You can explain a technique, but it needs to be adaptable, because each situation can change your reaction as well. And so what I'm trying to give you with this course is the thinking, the fact to have a completely different opinion or view and not following only just trendy categories of products as the market is categorizing, without wanting to say any kind of name. But think in terms of overlapping product integration and everything else. I hope you found it useful. I did my best, and I hope you appreciate the efforts. I want to remind you that there is a playlist with everything in there. And so you just click the playlist. You have all lesson, including this one there. If you're interested on some topics, you'll find a lot of other videos more related to that. Okay? I do hope you enjoyed. Subscribe and you'll be notified when I release the next lesson. That is extremely important. I focus on the solutioning common mistake. And so I will zoom in a bit the technical aspect in terms of cloud and on-prem as well. Okay, thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate it. Take care. Bye.